The cellar of the farmer Triplets Farmhouse. They locked up 44 women in their basement, and what they did to them is horrible. When one 7-year-old Margaret Whitmore lifted the loose floorboards in the Brennan brothers' barn, she found 44 wooden crosses with 44 names carved in the dark. The newest cross had yesterday's date on it. The Brennan triplets were important people in their Missouri town. They were kind to travelers, loyal to the church, and everyone trusted them. But there was a terrible thing growing under their farmhouse for years. Women were disappearing from the Ozark settlements. Daughters, wives, sisters, and the people who were supposed to protect them called them runaways or troublemakers. The authorities didn't want to see the truth that Margaret found. She found the survivors locked up in that basement. She found the bodies in the fields. But when she tried to talk, the whole system turned against her. The sheriff, the judge, and even her father all chose to be quiet instead of doing the right thing. How do you fight evil when everyone else is trying to protect it? And how many more women would have to die before someone finally listened? When the wagon wheel broke, it made a sound like bones breaking, which made Margaret Whitmore fall against her father's shoulder as their horse reared in the traces. Reverend Samuel Whitmore steadied the reins with practiced hands. His weathered face was lined with worry as he looked over the damage. The iron rim had broken all the way through, leaving sharp metal teeth that would tear the wooden wheel to pieces if they tried to keep going down the rocky Ozark Trail. "Lord's testing us today, Margaret," her father said quietly, but his voice sounded more frustrated than faithful. They were still 20 miles from the next settlement, and storm clouds were gathering overhead like dark judgment. When Margaret was 17, she had gone on these monthly trips with her father to the remote Missouri hill country, enough times to know that if they were stuck here, they would have to accept any hospitality they could find, even if it came with problems. The whitewashed walls and neat split-rail fences of the Brennan farmhouse stood out among the trees like an answer to prayer. In a place where both were hard to find, they spoke of wealth and order. Before they even called out, Jeremiah Brennan came out of the barn. His broad shoulders and graying beard showed that he was the oldest of the famous triplets. His brothers followed him. Ezekiel, who had a kind smile and spoke softly, and Caleb, whose pale eyes seemed to see everything but say nothing. Jeremiah's voice rang out across the yard with real warmth when he said, "Reverend Whitmore, what brings you to this small part of God's creation?" He looked worried when he saw that their wheel was broken. "Ah, I see that the Lord has put you in need of help. Brothers, we have guests who need our Christian charity." People in the hill communities had only good things to say about the Brennan triplets. They gave a lot of money to every church, fed families who were having a hard time, and welcomed travelers into their home without thinking twice. Sheriff Coleman Brass once said that the area would be better off with more men like him. While Jeremiah and Ezekiel helped her father unload their things, Margaret couldn't help but look at Caleb, who was standing next to the barn door, staring at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Of course you'll stay the night," Ezekiel said in a voice as soft as spring rain. "That's our housekeeper, Martha. She's made a nice dinner for us, and we have comfortable beds for tired travelers. Jeremiah can fix that wheel in the morning." He pointed to the farmhouse with real hospitality, but Margaret could tell that Caleb was watching her every move as they crossed the yard. The inside of the farmhouse showed that it had been well cared for and that the owners were doing well. The floors were clean. The furniture was simple but strong, and religious books were prominently displayed on shelves and tables. Martha, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, served cornbread, salt pork, and preserved vegetables, while the brothers told their father stories about the different charitable works they did in the area. They talked about widows whose roofs they'd fixed, orphans they'd fed, and families who were having a hard time getting through tough times. Jeremiah said, "The Lord has blessed us with abundance," and he waved his weathered hands around. "And abundance shared is abundance multiplied. We think it's our Christian duty to help people in need, especially those who are weak, like women traveling alone, immigrants without family, and people who might not get the help they need from society." Margaret noticed that Caleb's fork stopped moving when his brother talked about weak women, but his face didn't change. She couldn't put her finger on why. But something in that moment of stillness sent ice through her veins. When her father started talking about the story of the Good Samaritan, she said she needed to go outside for some fresh air because the heat inside had made her feel lightheaded. The first bite of autumn had made the Missouri night crisp, and the smell of wood smoke and dying leaves filled the air. Margaret walked toward the barn because she felt restless and didn't know why. In the dark, the building looked big, and the moonlight made its old boards look silver. Her father praised her curiosity, but also worried that it would get her into trouble. Something about the farm's too-perfect order struck her as deliberate, like a stage set designed to convince rather than just exist. The barn door was open just a little bit, letting in some light. Margaret pushed it open even more, letting moonlight spill across the hay bales and farming tools that were set up in a military-like way. But as she walked further into the room, her foot hit something that shouldn't have been there, a loose floorboard that made a hollow sound when she stepped on it, as if there was empty space below. Margaret knelt next to the loose boards, and her curiosity got the better of her caution. They came up easily, as if they had been moved many times before. This showed wooden steps going down into complete darkness. The smell that came up from below made her stomach clench. It was a mix of human waste, unwashed bodies, and something else she couldn't put her finger on, but knew was the smell of fear itself. Margaret fumbled for the oil lamp that was hanging next to the barn door. Her hands were shaking as she lit it with matches from her dress pocket. The flame made shadows that danced as she went down the rough stairs. The creaking of the old wood under her feet sounded like gunshots in the heavy silence. The cellar door opened in front of her, like a scene from the darkest parts of Revelation. It was a place that spoke of pain so deep that it seemed to have soaked into the stones. There were dozens of women's things lying around on the dirt floor, like the remains of lives that had been cut short, hair, ribbons, and colors that had once been bright, jewelry that had turned black with age and neglect, and pieces of clothing that had been ripped and stained beyond recognition. But the far wall took her breath away and made the lamp shake in her hand. It had 44 wooden crosses, each no bigger than her hand, lined up in neat rows like a cemetery for the damned. The names carved into each cross were Mary Sullivan, Ruth Freeman, and Elizabeth Morrison. These were the names of real women who had lived and breathed and felt hope and fear. There were dates next to the names, some going back 5 years and others being very recent. The newest cross had a date from yesterday and a name that made Margaret's blood run cold: Bridget Ali. The wood was still pale from being carved. She felt panic rise in her veins when she heard footsteps on the barn floor above. As heavy boots moved across the floor above, Margaret blew out the lamp and pressed herself against the wall of the cellar. She could see Caleb Brennan's pale face peeking down through the loose floorboards. His eyes reflected the little bit of moonlight that got into the barn like a predator's. For what seemed like forever, their eyes met through the cracks in the wooden floor. Then he smiled, a smile that showed no warmth or humanity. It confirmed every instinct that had screamed warning since they got there. Margaret stayed still until he walked away. Then she climbed the stairs to the cellar on legs that barely held her weight. She put the loose boards back in place, with hands that shook like leaves in the fall. Her mind was having a hard time processing the horror she had seen. The Brennan brothers were monsters hiding behind masks of Christian charity. They were pillars of their community, generous benefactors, and trusted friends. Caleb now knew that she had seen their terrible secret. Margaret saw him standing at the kitchen window, his pale eyes following her as she moved across the yard. She slipped back toward the farmhouse. They would leave this place tomorrow. But Margaret knew with a sickening certainty that the horror she had found would stay with her long after their wagon wheel was fixed and they were back in the safety of civilization. Not what the Brennan brothers did to 44 women, but how many more would die before someone had the guts to tell the world the impossible truth. As Margaret tried to pour her father's morning coffee, her hands shook. The memory of the 44 crosses burning behind her eyes was like brands. She hadn't slept much because every creak of the farmhouse settling made her think Caleb Brennan was coming for her. When she finally got the nerve to tell her dad what she had found out, he reacted quickly and in a way that hurt her deeply. "Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore, you will not lie about these good Christian men," he said, his voice sharp with shame and fear. "Whatever you thought you saw in the dark was just your imagination running wild. The Brennan brothers are important members of this community. But Margaret knew what she had seen, and more importantly, what it meant. When their fixed wagon left the farm that morning, she saw Caleb watching from the barn door with the same cold smile on his face. He touched the brim of his hat in a fake gesture of politeness, and Margaret knew what it meant. They would see each other again. Her father wouldn't talk about it anymore. He thought that her attempts to talk about it were signs of feminine hysteria that needed to be corrected rather than thought about. The next 3 weeks were a nightmare of investigation that looked like normal trips to small towns. While her father was busy with his church work, Margaret quietly talked to families all over the area, asking them carefully about their missing daughters, sisters, and wives. What she found out made her blood run cold. The Brennan brothers didn't just kill women. They went after the weakest members of society on purpose, knowing that no one would care or notice when they went missing. She met the Sullivans in Pine Ridge. Their 7-year-old daughter Mary had gone missing 2 years earlier while walking to the next farm to help with a difficult birth. Sheriff Brass said she probably ran off with a traveling man, Mrs. Sullivan told Margaret, her eyes empty from grief that had never been allowed to show. Girls like Mary, who have their heads full of romantic ideas, don't think about how much shame they bring on their families. But Mary wasn't that kind of girl, miss. She was as good as gold. Margaret learned at the Morrison homestead that Elizabeth Morrison had gone missing after taking a job as a seamstress for respectable people near Brennan Ridge. When Elizabeth didn't come home as promised, her family asked around and were told that she had been fired for stealing and had fled the county in shame. But Elizabeth never stole so much as an apple in her life. Her brother John said, his hands clenched into fists. She sent money home all the time, but then one day the letters stopped. The sheriff said there was nothing to look into. Every family Margaret visited made the pattern clearer. Authorities systematically discredited women who went missing by portraying them as immoral, unstable, or criminal to explain why they didn't look into what happened to them. Sheriff Coleman Brass had turned down every request for search parties or questions, sending grieving families away with cold efficiency. Margaret realized that she was not only writing about individual tragedies, but also proof of a coordinated effort to silence whole communities. When she met Moses Freeman, the freed slave who worked as the town's blacksmith, she had her big break. The sound of hammer on anvil drew Margaret to his shop. It was a steady, strong, and defiant rhythm that reminded her of heartbeats. Moses was a man of about 45, with smart eyes that seemed to take in everything, but not show anything. Like her father's eyes, but not the willful blindness that Samuel Whitmore had. "You're asking about women who are missing," Moses said right away as Margaret walked up to his forge. He spoke with the careful tone of a man who knew how to get around in white society without losing his dignity. Word travels fast in small places, Miss Whitmore. People are talking about the preacher's daughter going from house to house and bringing up old sorrows. Margaret's cheeks got hot, but Moses held up a hand before she could say anything. "I'm not criticizing, child. I'm just saying that you're not the only one who has noticed the pattern. My Ruth disappeared 2 years ago and took a job as a maid for the Brennan brothers. She was supposed to come home every Sunday for supper, but when she didn't, I went looking." His hammer hit the red-hot iron with a lot of force. "Sheriff Brass told me Ruth had gone back south where she belonged. Said freed slaves were naturally drawn to wandering, and I shouldn't expect loyalty from her kind." The bitterness in Moses's voice was carefully controlled, but Margaret could hear the grief underneath it. "But you didn't believe him," she said. Moses put down his hammer and looked at her directly, his eyes carefully measuring her. "Miss Whitmore, for the past 5 years, I've been keeping track of every woman who has gone missing in this county. 43 names, ages, descriptions, and last known whereabouts." Sheriff Brass dismissed every family. Every disappearance was explained away as moral failing or natural wandering. "You want to know why I started counting? Because Ruth was the smartest person I ever knew, and she would never have just disappeared without a word. Someone killed my daughter, and that same person has been killing women all over these hills." Margaret's heart raced when she realized she had found the ally she needed so badly. Moses Freeman wasn't just another sad dad. He was a man who had been carefully writing down the very proof she had been looking for. When she told him about the crosses in the Brennan cellar and the 44 names carved into wood, his face went from tired to determined. 44, he said again softly. Ruth Freeman was number 43 on my list. For a moment, they sat in silence, the heaviness of that math hanging between them like a gravestone. Moses walked over to a wooden chest next to his forge and took out a leather-bound ledger with neat writing on its pages. Every name, every date, every family has been told that their grief doesn't matter. I thought that someday someone would want to know the truth. Margaret opened the ledger with great care and looked over pages of carefully kept records that showed years of hard work. Moses wrote down more than just names and dates. He also wrote down patterns of behavior, links between victims, and most importantly, proof that local authorities were intentionally hiding the disappearances. "Why didn't you give this to the federal marshals?" she asked. Moses's laugh was sad. "Miss Whitmore, I'm a freed slave in Missouri. My word against white men, especially respected white men, isn't worth the breath it takes to speak it. But your word, the daughter of a preacher, educated, white, respectable, that carries weight I'll never have." He leaned forward, his voice urgent. "But we need more than just accusations. We need proof that even dishonest officials can't ignore." As Margaret read through Moses's papers, she started to understand something terrible. The Brennan farm was at a very important crossroads where 3 counties, Crawford, Gasconade, and Maries, met. This made it hard to figure out who was in charge. Sheriff Brass could say that the women who went missing were in a different county, which meant that families had to look for help elsewhere. But when they tried, the officials in those counties would listen to Brass, which created an endless cycle of past responsibility that made sure no real investigation ever happened. "It's not just incompetence," Margaret whispered, tracing the careful notes in Moses's ledger with her finger. "It's on purpose. They made the system to keep the Brennan brothers safe." Moses nodded sadly. "Judge Cornelius Wade signs every dismissal order and every refusal to investigate. The brothers have money, power, and political connections that reach all the way to Jefferson City. They've built themselves a perfect machine for murder, and every official in 3 counties helps keep it running." Margaret closed the ledger, her head spinning with the size of the conspiracy she had found. The bodies of 44 women were buried on the Brennan farm. Their families were kept quiet by a system that put the killers' reputations above the victims' lives. But now she and Moses had proof, names, dates, and other information that could no longer be written off as hysteria or fantasy. The question that kept her up at night was whether anyone with real power would be willing to listen, or if the conspiracy was too big for justice to ever catch up with it. Margaret and Moses's plan came from a place of desperation and anger that was right. They would watch the Brennan farm at night and collect proof that even the most corrupt officials couldn't ignore. Moses made a special tool out of his blacksmith materials, a thin iron rod that could be used to look through cellar windows without being seen. Margaret stole her father's field glasses, saying that it was necessary for God's work. She wasn't sure if God would approve of how she did it, even if he blessed her cause. 3 nights of careful watching showed Margaret patterns that scared her to death. The brothers worked together with great care, switching off on different jobs. Jeremiah took care of the business side of things. He met with well-dressed men who came in covered wagons and did business that involved exchanging money and people. Ezekiel was in charge of the psychological manipulation. He calmed scared women down and got them to trust their captors by being nice to them. But Caleb was the most dangerous. He stalked the property like a predator and punished people with brutal efficiency. On the 4th night, they saw something so terrible that it would stay with Margaret for the rest of her life. A young woman with auburn hair and an Irish accent came to the farm in the back of a merchant's wagon. She was holding a letter that promised her honest work and fair pay. Margaret knew right away who she was from Moses's descriptions. Bridget Ali, the one 9-year-old immigrant whose cross she'd seen in the cellar. Margaret had found out about the horrible event the day before, when Bridget had died. But Bridget Ali was still alive. She was very much alive, and the Brennan brothers' evil plan was about to make her the 45th victim. Margaret was frozen in horror as Ezekiel greeted Bridget with his usual kindness, offering her food and shelter and telling her about the great chance that lay ahead of her. It was clear that the young woman felt better. She had been on the road for weeks, sleeping outside and going without food, desperate for the safety and respectability the brothers promised. "We have to do something," Margaret said quietly to Moses, who was lying next to her in the tall grass that looked out over the farm. He had the same mix of anger and helplessness on his face as she did. "We can't just stand by and let them take another innocent woman." Moses's answer was hard to hear, but it was full of grim determination. "We can't save her if we die, Miss Margaret." "But maybe we can save the others." He pointed to the cellar windows, where there was movement below in the faint light. "Look over there. She's not by herself." Margaret gasped as she changed the field glasses. She could see not only Bridget being led down the wooden stairs through the dirty cellar windows, but also other people moving around in the dark. Other women are alive, in jail, and waiting for help or death. The cross with Bridget's name on it didn't mark her death. It marked her capture and entry into a hell that could last days, weeks, or months before her suffering ended. Margaret's voice shook as she asked, "How many do you think are down there?" Moses was counting shadows, using the same level of accuracy that a blacksmith would use to do the worst math possible. 6, maybe 7. "It's hard to tell in the dim light, but they're alive, Miss Margaret. They're all still alive." The fact that they could actually save living women instead of just getting revenge on dead ones changed their mission from documenting to rescuing, but it also made it much more dangerous. The brothers weren't just murderers, they were also slave traders, who ran a complex network that reached far beyond their farm in Missouri. Margaret and Moses were about to fight not only 3 killers, but also a whole system of corruption and complicity. 2 nights later, all 3 brothers went to town for what Jeremiah called important business meetings. This was their first attempt to save them. Moses and Margaret walked up to the farm with tools that Moses had made just for breaking locks and opening doors. There was a heavy iron padlock on the door to the cellar, but Moses was able to open it quickly. The smell coming from the cellar was worse than Margaret remembered. The smell of human waste, unwashed bodies, infection, and the sour smell of despair itself. But deep down, there was something that made her heart soar with hope. The sound of women's voices, weak but alive, whispering words of comfort and defiance. These people weren't broken victims waiting to die. They were survivors who were holding on to life and sanity by helping each other and refusing to give up. Bridget O'Malley was chained up near the door. Her auburn hair was matted, and her green dress was ripped, but her eyes were still full of life. Margaret could see 5 other women of different ages behind her. They all looked like they had been in captivity, but none of them looked like they were broken or submissive, which was what their captors had tried to make them look like. "Who are you?" Bridget asked in a soft Irish accent. "Are you here to help us or hurt us more?" "We're here to get you out," Margaret said, her voice steady, even though tears were streaming down her face. "This is Moses Freeman, and my name is Margaret Whitmore. We know what the Brennan brothers have done, and we will make sure they pay for it." It was harder for Margaret than she thought it would be to free 6 women from their chains while staying completely quiet. Each woman was tied up in a different way, and some of them showed signs of having tried to escape many times and being punished harshly for it. Moses worked quickly and methodically, using his blacksmith tools to quickly break apart the crude iron shackles. Margaret helped hold the weak women steady and gave them as much comfort as she could. But disaster struck with terrible speed as they were getting ready to take the rescued women out of the cellar. The sound of hooves in the yard above made Margaret's blood run cold. The brothers had come back from town early, and the light from their lanterns was already making shadows move across the barn floor. Margaret and Moses were stuck in the cellar with 6 traumatized women. They had to choose between trying to escape, which would probably kill everyone, or staying hidden and hoping the brothers didn't find them. Caleb Brennan's voice cut through the night air like a knife. "Something's wrong. The lock's been broken." His footsteps moved across the barn floor with predatory certainty, and Margaret realized he was following their trail with the skill of a born hunter. His pale face appeared at the top of the cellar stairs in a matter of seconds. When he saw the group huddled below, his cold smile spread like poison. "Well, well," he said, sounding like a cat that had caught a lot of mice at once. Miss Margaret Whitmore and her black friend have come to see us, and they've been bothering our guests." He slowly walked down the stairs, enjoying the fear his presence caused, while his brothers talked above about how to deal with the problem. Moses stepped in front of Margaret and the freed women to protect them, holding his blacksmith hammer like a weapon. "Let these women go, Brennan! This ends tonight!" Caleb's laugh sounded like glass breaking. "Oh, it ends tonight, all right. But not the way you planned." He took a gun out of his coat, and the metal shone in the light of the lantern. "You've caused us a lot of trouble, Miss Whitmore. You've cost us time, money, and our good name. We need to be paid back." Margaret would never forget the fight that followed. Moses told Caleb to be very brave, and he did, taking a bullet to the shoulder, but still knocking the gun out of the killer's hand. After that, things got crazy. Margaret and the women she saved fought their way up the cellar stairs, while Moses and Caleb fought in the dark below. Jeremiah and Ezekiel were waiting with guns when they got to the surface, but the night had become their friend. Margaret led the women through the dark to the old mine shaft they had chosen as a hiding place. She was heartbroken to hear Moses crying out in pain behind them. They had saved 6 innocent women, but the cost was becoming clear. Moses Freeman, the man whose bravery and record-keeping had made their mission possible, was now fighting for his life against monsters who showed no mercy to anyone who stood in their way. The abandoned mine shaft was both a safe place and a prison for Margaret and the 6 women she saved. They huddled together in the dark, hidden among the timber supports and old mining tools, listening to the sounds of pursuit echoing across the Missouri hills. The Brennan brothers had called in all of their friends, Sheriff Brass's deputies, local militiamen, and even volunteers from the community who thought they were hunting down dangerous criminals instead of helping to cover up a pattern of murder. Margaret's hands shook as she bandaged the cuts and scrapes on the rescued women's bodies with strips of her petticoat. These wounds showed that they had been abused for a long time. Bridget Alley, who had been through a lot herself, had become the natural leader of the survivors. Her Irish accent was soft but strong as she whispered words of comfort to the others. She said, "We're alive," over and over like a prayer. "They didn't kill us, and we're still here." But every hour that went by, Margaret's heart broke more and more. Moses Freeman had not come out of that cellar, and the smoke coming from the Brennan farm made it look like the brothers were methodically destroying evidence. When she made the hard choice to lead the women to safety, she left behind the one man who had the guts to write down their crimes and fight for justice. That choice felt like it would crush her spirit completely. On the second day of hiding, something terrible happened that no one saw coming. Sheriff Coleman Brass himself came to the mine entrance. His badge shone in the afternoon sun, and he casually rested his hand on the grip of his gun. Deputy Marshal Frank Collins, a federal officer, stood behind him. His presence should have given him hope, but his cold expression said otherwise. Margaret's fear grew as she realized that the corruption went even higher than she had thought. "Miss Margaret Whitmore," Sheriff Brass called into the dark. His voice sounded worried, but no one believed him. "You and your friends need to come out now. There are serious charges against you, including assault on respected citizens, theft of property, and inciting racial violence. But if you give up peacefully, I'm sure we can come to some kind of agreement." Margaret knew better than to believe Brass's promises, but the women he had saved were getting weaker from hunger and exposure, and some of them were showing signs of infection from their untreated wounds. When she told Bridget about her worries in a low voice, the Irish woman was very angry. She said, "It's better to die free than to live as their slaves. We know what they'll do to us if we go back." But Deputy Marshal Collins stepped forward and told everyone what he was really there for, which was Margaret's worst fear. "Miss Whitmore, I have warrants for your arrest on charges of criminal conspiracy, assault with deadly weapons, and inciting slave rebellion. The Negro Moses Freeman has confessed to leading you astray with false accusations against the Brennan brothers. He's admitted that his supposed documentation was fabricated to settle personal grievances." The lie hurt Margaret like a punch in the face. Moses would never have changed his mind about the evidence he had carefully written down. This meant that he was either dead and they were using his name to justify their actions, or they were torturing him to get him to confess. Both possibilities made her feel equally angry and hopeless. The system she had hoped to change had turned out to be completely corrupt, and the Brennan brothers' power and reach had even affected the federal government. When Sheriff Brass said that all 6 women would be charged with prostitution, vagrancy, and making false accusations against good citizens, Margaret's plan to use them as witnesses fell apart right away. He said in a voice that sounded practiced and authoritative, "These poor women have been led astray by radical northern ideas. It's sad that outside agitators can corrupt the simple minds of the weak. They've been convinced to make wild claims against men who were trying to help them find honest work." As Margaret watched how the community reacted to their capture, it became clear how devastatingly effective this plan was. The same families who had cried over their missing daughters now turned away as the rescued women were marched through town in chains. The story was told very well. People said that Margaret was a troubled young woman who had been affected by extreme abolitionism, and that Moses Freeman was a bitter former slave who wanted to get back at white benefactors. Judge Cornelius Wade's courtroom turned into a stage for planned unfairness, where the truth itself was on trial. Margaret learned that Wade was not only corrupt, but also Jeremiah Brennan's brother-in-law. This family connection explained how well the judicial system worked with the killers it protected. Judge Wade said that Margaret couldn't use Moses's papers as evidence because they were the made-up ramblings of a known criminal and racial agitator. Through character assassination and legal loopholes, the testimony of the rescued women was systematically destroyed. Bridget Alley, whose spirit had kept the others going during their time in jail, completely lost it when Judge Wade said that her immigrant status made her testimony worthless and that she would be deported right after serving her sentence for making false accusations. The other survivors changed their stories one by one because they were threatened with legal action, shunned by society, and promised lenient treatment if they admitted they were confused. The betrayal by Margaret's father hurt the most. Reverend Samuel Whitmore went to court not to support his daughter, but to publicly condemn what she did and ask the court for mercy for what he called a young woman led astray by dangerous ideas. His testimony made Margaret look mentally unstable, prone to hysteria and delusions that had been fueled by her connections with radical groups in the community. He said, "My daughter has always had a lot of imagination," but his voice was steady and his eyes couldn't meet Margaret's. "I worry that her recent behavior is a result of reading inappropriate books about the Northern abolitionists and women's suffrage movements. These ideas have clearly upset her natural feminine sensibilities and caused her to accuse men of crimes they didn't commit, like showing Christian charity to people in need." As Margaret sat in her jail cell waiting to be sent to the state asylum for mental treatment where Judge Wade had ordered her to go, the personal cost of seeking justice became too much for her to bear. She could see smoke coming from Moses Freeman's blacksmith shop through the barred window. She knew that the last evidence of the Brennan brothers' crimes was being systematically erased. People thought the ledger with 5 years of detailed records was made up, and the person who wrote it had completely disappeared from official records. But the last betrayal happened when Margaret found out how big the conspiracy was that was protecting the Brennan brothers. With casual cruelty, Deputy Marshal Collins said that the trafficking operation went far beyond Missouri's borders, with buyers and sellers in Kansas City, St. Louis, New Orleans, and even Chicago. The Brennan farm was just one part of a network that made a lot of money for everyone involved, from local officials to federal marshals to judges and politicians whose campaigns were funded by the trade in human suffering. Collins asked, "You really thought you could bring down something this big?" His voice was full of real surprise at how naive she was. "Miss Whitmore, you found out about an operation that involved some of the most powerful men in the state. Did you really think they would let a preacher's daughter and a freed slave ruin decades of hard work?" As Margaret was taken away to the asylum, she saw Caleb Brennan standing outside the courthouse. His pale eyes followed her with a look of satisfied malice. He touched the brim of his hat in the same way he had that morning at the farm, as if to say, "Hello." And Margaret knew that he was enjoying not only her loss, but also her complete destruction. The man who killed 44 women not only got away with it, but he also used the system against people who tried to find out the truth. Before the doors of the asylum wagon closed, Margaret saw Bridget Alley being put on a different vehicle. She had finally given up hope because she knew that telling the truth had only caused more pain. At that moment, Margaret realized how horrible their fight had been, not just against individual evil, but against a system so corrupt that justice was impossible, and truth was the most dangerous lie of all. Margaret didn't plan her escape from the asylum transport. It happened because of people she never thought she'd find in the corrupt world of Missouri justice. As the wagon carrying her toward what she knew would be permanent imprisonment jolted along the rutted road, a group of armed men appeared from the forest like angels of death. But these people weren't on the Brennan brothers' side. They were federal marshals who were following orders from Washington. A stern-faced woman led them, and her presence made everyone respect and fear her right away. Emma Goldman introduced herself quickly and efficiently, like someone who is used to working in dangerous places. She was an investigative journalist who was known for exposing corruption at the highest levels of government, and the local conspirators never could have guessed how Margaret's case would have gotten her attention. Goldman knew a lot of people, including abolitionists, women's rights activists, and federal officials who were getting more and more worried about reports of widespread lawlessness in the Missouri Territory. "Miss Whitmore," Goldman said as the federal marshals freed Margaret from her restraints, "your father's letters to church leaders in Jefferson City included things he probably thought would make you look bad. Instead, they confirmed patterns we've been tracking across multiple states. You've stumbled onto something much bigger than a local murder conspiracy." Goldman's face was lined with the marks of someone who had fought impossible battles for years, and her eyes showed the same determination that had made Margaret fight for justice even when everyone else was against her. The trip to St. Louis was Margaret's first look at the size of the network she had been fighting. Goldman said that the Brennan operation was part of a regional trafficking network that had been going on since the end of the Civil War. They took advantage of the chaos of Reconstruction to target the most vulnerable people in society. Federal investigators had been following similar operations in Arkansas, Kansas, and Tennessee, but it was almost impossible to prosecute them because of local corruption. Margaret's paperwork gave them the missing links they needed. Goldman told her as their carriage rolled toward the city. Moses Freeman's ledger survived. Before he died, he managed to hide his papers in a place only you would think to look, buried beneath the headstone of his daughter Ruth in the colored cemetery outside town. Federal agents found them 2 days ago, and they show crimes that happened in 5 states and involved dozens of officials. Margaret felt like she had been hit when she heard about Moses's death. But Goldman's next revelation gave her a little bit of hope in the middle of her grief. "Miss Whitmore, he didn't die in that cellar." Moses Freeman lived long enough to testify before federal investigators, and his testimony has led to the largest criminal investigation in Missouri's history. The man you thought you had left behind actually managed to expose the whole network before he died from his injuries. Margaret learned in St. Louis that her story was already changing from a local scandal to a national outrage. Goldman's first article in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch had been picked up by newspapers all over the country. The combination of documented evidence and surviving witness testimony had caused a huge public outcry that corrupt officials could no longer ignore or dismiss. The federal courthouse was a place for a different kind of justice than what Margaret had seen in Judge Wade's corrupt courtroom. Here, evidence was looked at instead of thrown out. Witnesses were not scared, but they were safe. And the full power of the federal government was used against the network of corruption that had kept the Brennan brothers safe for so long. Margaret's testimony, which was given in front of a packed courtroom and recorded by stenographers for national distribution, became the main focus of a case that revealed not only the murders on the Brennan farm, but also the organized crime that made them possible. She spoke for Moses Freeman, whose voice had been silenced, but whose written records lived on as proof. She spoke for the 44 women whose crosses she had found in that awful cellar. She also spoke for the survivors who had the strength to testify, even though they had been through a lot of trauma and fear for years. But the real breakthrough came when Bridget Ali, who had been stopped before her deportation, got on the witness stand and showed everyone how strong she was. The Irish immigrant who had been broken by Judge Wade's threats had found her voice again, and her testimony about how the trafficking network worked backed up evidence from several states. "They told us we were worthless," Bridget said, her voice strong and clear as she faced the packed courtroom. "They told us that no one would believe us, and that no one would care if we lived or died. But Margaret Whitmore cared. Moses Freeman cared. And now you're all here, listening to our voices and knowing that we were worth fighting for. The federal investigation showed how big the conspiracy Margaret had stumbled upon really was. The Brennan brothers weren't just killers in their own area. They were part of a network that stretched from New Orleans to Chicago. They brought vulnerable women to brothels, forced labor camps, and private buyers in the growing territories. It was to protect the operation that Judge Wade, Sheriff Brass, and dozens of other officials were getting regular payments. The trials that came after were a reckoning that broke the corrupt system that kept systematic evil going in the area. Jeremiah and Caleb Brennan were found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. Ezekiel, on the other hand, killed himself before the trial, so he wouldn't have to hear the testimony of his victims. Judge Wade and Sheriff Brass were sent to prison, which effectively ended their careers and power. Dozens of lower-level officials were also facing prosecution or shame. Margaret went from being a young woman who had lost her credibility to being a symbol of bravery and moral strength. Women's rights groups, church groups, and reform societies all over the country asked her to speak. People who were fighting against systemic injustice used her story as a rallying cry, and her testimony helped lead to federal laws that would stop similar conspiracies from happening. But the cost of justice was still high for the people involved. Margaret's relationship with her father never fully healed after he betrayed her during the trials. Reverend Whitmore eventually admitted that he was morally cowardly and spent the rest of his life helping families affected by trafficking. But the trauma of seeing such systematic evil and knowing how close the whole conspiracy came to success left him with psychological scars that would never fully heal. 5 years after the trials, Margaret stood in the small cemetery where Moses Freeman was buried. She put flowers on his headstone next to the flowers on the graves of the 44 women whose bodies had finally been found and buried properly. The federal investigation had found each victim returned their bodies to their families when possible and made sure that their names were not forgotten as victims, but as people whose lives had meaning and whose deaths needed justice. Margaret had married Thomas Hartwell, one of the federal prosecutors who helped bring the conspiracy to trial. Together, they set up safe houses for trafficking survivors all over Missouri. Their work continued the mission that had begun in that terrible cellar beneath the Brennan barn, making sure that women who were at risk were safe, that their voices were heard, and that their lives mattered in a society that too often ignored their pain. Margaret thought about the cost of seeking justice in a world that protects the powerful at the expense of the weak as she stood among the headstones with the names she had first seen carved on wooden crosses. Moses Freeman had to pay with his life. The people who lived through it had to deal with years of trauma, and she had paid with her faith in the institutions that were supposed to protect the weakest members of society and her innocence. But they also learned something important, that people who are brave enough to speak truth to power can expose and defeat evil. The 44 crosses in that cellar were signs of lives that had been forgotten. The 44 headstones in this quiet cemetery told a stronger story, that every life matters, and that staying quiet in the face of systematic evil makes us all part of keeping it going.